Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where it's about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the season finale of Interview with the Vampire. A great season finale. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. First and foremost, I didn't realize this was the season finale because it's an odd number. It's 7 episodes, so I was under the impression, I was like, oh, it's going to be 8 episodes. I think a lot of stuff was saying it was going to be 8 episodes. I guess most people, I guess that's like early information, think it was going to be 8. They made it 7. I don't know. Maybe it was going to be 8, but they moved episode 8 to season 2 or something like that. I don't know. Either way, okay, so we're picking up in the aftermath of last episode. Obviously, Daniel's got his reservation being like, looking at Rashid, he's like, all right, something's up here. And I love that throughout the episode, he's listening to Louis' story, but he keeps focusing on Rashid. He's like, sorry, I'm losing focus. And you can tell Louis probably like piecing it together. It's like, well, he can get inside of Daniel's head, so he's probably thinking like, Daniel's, like, those hamster wheels are going inside of Daniel's head. But then Daniel later on sees Rashid in the sun. Even I was like, oh, he's in the sun. I was like, not unless they're bullshitting him. But I'm like, I was about to say, why go to, like, because not unless Louis made it so it seemed like this place, his home is a little bit different, where it's like, maybe it seems like, oh, you're out in the sunshine, but maybe it's like some illusion or something. I wasn't quite sure, but I was like, oh, maybe Rashid is, but it's like, then what was it that Daniel remembered? It's like, he ran into Rashid. It's like, not unless that's a concocted memory. I didn't know what to fully make of that, so. Either way, the trio has continued there are no more pretenses of like, oh, let's not pretend like we don't hate each other. But they just kind of make do. They do their thing. And obviously Claudia is plotting with Louis, but she refuses to tell Louis everything. Understandably, it's an abusive relationship. And it is a very Stockholm relationship. And Louis, Claudia knew what kind of hold Lestat had over Louis. Because they didn't have the same thing. Yes, Lestat was her maker, but he never loved her like he loved Louis. Like, the fact of the matter is, Louis was his light, his everything. So despite everything for Louis, this is the person who made you, who killed you, who gave you a new lease on life. He was the first person you could be openly you about. I mean, he's the first person you were openly, well, not the first person, but this is where you were openly accepted your sexuality, you know, because before he denied it, even within the experiences he had in the past, was his friend that he met up, well, you know, quote unquote friend he met up with a couple episodes back. So let's stop. And once again, that sire bond, but even then it's like Claudia didn't have that same connection, despite like the sire bond isn't everything. There's so much that it's so much more stacked on top of Louis' circumstances than Claudia. Because out of both of these people, Louis is the only one she really cared about. So she's continuing to plot. And just because she knows, like, right, she knows what Lestat thinks. She knows how he operates. So she knows, like, hey, I can't just keep plotting with you all the time, because if we keep doing this telepathic thing, Lestat's going to know something's up. But even later on, she's like, oh yeah, like, I'm pushing this whole party idea, because she's like, right, people showing up, people are leaving things at the doors because people believe them to be devils, believe them to be demons, or at the very least made a deal with the devil. And that guy showed up. He was sick, basically wanting access to the Fountain of Youth, because it's like, yeah, it's understandable when you continue to not age and you live there long enough where people start to recognize, hey, you haven't aged, even to the point they went to see Tom, and Tom's like, hey, this is a picture of me along with those two fellas there. Do you notice anything different? I would have been like, well, you don't have the big mustache anymore. But she points out, like, oh, you didn't have that cross X across your face. And he's just like, charming. But it's like, yeah, like, I've obviously gotten older. They've remained the same. So everyone's picking up on it. So we also learned all the ways a vampire can die. It's typically the ones you think. It's the starvation ends up being one, drinking dead men's blood. I feel like I don't know too many things that have used the dead men's blood thing, but I feel like that's come up before. I feel like maybe True Blood might have used the dead man's blood thing. I don't know if that ever came up in the Vampire Diaries, really, like the blood of the dead. I don't remember if they ever said, like, because it doesn't, if it ever came up, it never came up that often. Maybe those Vampire Diaries were like, dead men's blood will have an effect. I don't think it'd kill a vampire, but maybe it makes them sick. I don't remember. So that's one way. Another way is fire. Yeah, which was a good old classic, and another good old classic, decapitation. But for them, it's like we're at a disadvantage. He is older than us, he is faster than us, and he has access to powers. I mean, they don't fully know what Lestat can do. I mean, because whatever, and I even love the way Louis put it. It's like, yeah, like whatever he gave to us is very diminished on what he has. It's like, and I'm curious, is that typically how that happens? Like, what a vampire gets, will they always get like a fraction of you? Is it almost like a, using DBZ examples, going from Goku, a full-fledged Saiyan, to Gohan, who's a half Saiyan, to Pan, who's a quarter Saiyan. So I wonder if the same thing would be applicable in that regard of like, because Louis might be the first person, they always will have like a half of his ability, and maybe it depends on who you pass it on to first. So like maybe the more you make, like not even like, okay, so if Louis makes someone, the power is even more diminished. Maybe the more Lestat makes people, the more it's diminished. So maybe just, I'm thinking too much about it, but I'm curious, like, would that be like a principle of it, or will it always be like, nah, you will always get maybe a fourth of your predecessor's power. And could you ever overcompensate that for getting older? So, like, for example, for Louis, he, could he, if he ever got as old as Lestat, which he currently would be old and wouldn't what Lestat, because currently Lestat's 180, Louis 61, and this is in like the 1930s. So, because Louis not, he'd be like, what, he's like 150, 140 now, maybe? Something of that ilk. So would he be like, if he got to 180, would he be as strong as Lestat, or would he always be weaker than Lestat? Just questions like that. Like that comment feels like there's so many different ways you could interpret that. I mean, there's probably like, I'm trying to put it almost in video game, or like I said, like just numeric values of just like, right, will you always have like a little bit of like your buffs will never reach. They will always have limits of how strong or how powerful you can get because of that. I don't know. Maybe the older a vampire is when they make you, the stronger you potentially could be and eventually reach. Or maybe there is no cap for you. As long as you continue to age, you'll always get stronger and stronger. I don't know. Once again, I'm overthinking it, but just that point was like, right, we'll never like fully match him, so they had to outwit him. So Claudia loving to poke the bear. It's like, right, let's make an extravaganza. We can't, because Lestat was like, we can't stay in New Orleans anymore. There's too much attention, much people know about us. And for him, it's like, this is when the pitchfork type of shit comes out. It's like, it's one thing to slaughter people and, a little at a time, but it's like, you don't want to be caught in a compromised position where like the entire town comes, pitchforks and torches in hand. So it's like, right, well, you might as well go while the going's got going, while the going's getting good, right? While you have the opportunity, is what I'm trying to say. So, giving this opportunity, Claudia suggests throwing a big bash. It's like, right, we'll lay low, we'll continue doing what we're doing, but, and we'll eventually, I think, was it her, Lestat, that suggested the starvation thing of like, oh, and then when we bite into them, when we finally eat, it'll be that much more delicious. It'll be transcendent, exactly. And, so they're planning things out. Let's throw this big bash. They go to Tom to convince him to like, like the little committee known as the Raj, like put you guys, change the party to fit us, that making Louis the king of the Raj. Because also it plays into his ego. The guy who's, never going to turn down an opportunity because they were like, you lost one of your boats, right? Well, we can replace that, because it's good for your coffin business. But you'd have to put Lestat in that seat. And so they got together, made things happen in like a week's time. And it kept feeding into Lestat's ego. Claudia refuses to tell Louis the truth about what's going on, everything, because she wants him. It's like, right, you are going to be sleeping with him, and I know I need him distracted. And Louis like, no, I can do it. I could get close to him without, but it's like, no, you will lose yourself in it. She knows that about Louis. He can deny and pretend all he wants, but yeah, that's the case. And even he admits later on, it's like, right, he hated it. It's like, right, I wanted him dead, but I wanted him all mine. So I thought that was beautifully done because it's like, yeah, no matter what, trying to seduce the seducer, he ended up getting seduced too, because for him, it's like he found himself there at the bottom of that well again, looking in his eyes. It's like, there's no escaping it. He was like, in that moment, Louis was trying to make Lestat his, but it's like, no, in turn, he made me his, like I've always been, and I just couldn't break that hold of me. And even later on, Claudia's biting him and being like, idiot, wake up. Like, don't be swayed by Lestat. So, I figured out, jumping ahead a little bit, the Antoinette thing wasn't a surprise to me because the moment Louis heard her voice and he was like, a doll, and Claudia was like, what did you say? He's like, a doll. And then Tom was like, oh yeah, this place, you can almost hear. He's like, oh, but that hearing of yours must be crazy because all these voices here, like, yeah, this place is built so that stuff like really carries and echoes, but for you to pick up my voice amongst all this, and the fact is he heard Antoinette's voice, I was like, Lestat turned her. Yes, Lestat can't hear Louis and Claudia's voices, but a third vampire who'd be listening there, who's loyal to Lestat, would be able to. Because we hadn't seen Antoinette in a hot minute either, so it's like, I guess that speaks volume. Because he always felt like he was kind of alone. It was him against Claudia and Louis. But so that's why he made, because he knew, like, whether he knew Louis was plotting, he knew Claudia was plotting. He knew the child is too devious, to just be left alone, so when given the chance, he took advantage of that situation. So, and there's a whole situation with the twins and everything. And then there was also the dance, it's like, right. I love the way Louis painted that. He's like, yeah, it was a grim affair, but it is interesting. The one thing of that night that refused to be talked about, like, it was such a public thing, was Louis and Lestat's dancing kiss. Cause it's like, no. Because their thing was, amongst the disgusting things, all the death and destruction that night, the most disgusting thing was Louis and Lestat, right? So that is the fucked up nature of it. Like this beautiful moment that they had because it was deemed unfit to print. I was like, wow, that is crazy. Considering like you're printing about all these grisly murders and it's like, oh, this great ball ended in nothing but death and destruction. But that's one thing they refused to print. So they ended up bringing a whole bunch of people back to the house. And I love the little soliloquy that Lestat went on about kind of like this alchemy book. And it's like, right. And everyone started mentioning their ages. At this point, Claudia's 36, Louis 61, and Lestat being like 180 this November, So it's like, oh my God, everyone's like, oh, it's a philosopher's stone. And they open the pot and it's empty. And it's like, boom, got to doing their thing. Things got pretty brutal when Louis ripped off the dude's jaw and just like threw it on the ground and the guy was there with no bottom jaw. I'm like, that's the type of shit you typically would own. I feel like you wouldn't even see that really in a horror movie. You see that in like a horror video game, like some Dead Space type of shit, like, because that's one of those horror games that kind of gets really visceral and stuff like that. I mean, that's a video game where like you are slicing shit's body parts off and stuff, so but it's like, yeah, that feels something like you see in a video game. I feel like it's not something you see that often in like, I don't know, maybe because I don't continue. I should also take that back because I don't watch enough horror movies to really comment on that. But horror video games I've crossed enough over my years that I'd be like, yeah, that feels something like out of a horror video game. But I'm sure there are horror movies that go that hard in the paint. But I was like, and once again, just seeing him there with no bottom jaw and just like Louis ripping it off and just tossing it aside like it's nothing. I was like, this is a bloodbath, And they're locked in, and there's nothing they can do. Freak. I don't know. Why did I censor myself? Fuck. Claudia even, like, ripped out that one dude's eye. It's like, Jesus. And that wasn't just with her hands. That was her bare fucking teeth. She did that, too. So it came down to the last twin who was sick, and lo and behold, the reveal happens because Lestat's like, oh, I knew what you were doing. And he calls out to Antoinette, who's like, yeah, it was this. And it seemed like, oh, and Lestat was going to watch as Claudia died. It's like, oh, this way. And don't worry, Antoinette will make up. That child was always a mistake. She was a mess. This way, Antoinette will fit us much better. But then all of a sudden, Lestat starts throwing up. I was like, Claudia knew it. Claudia got the best of you, Lestat. You thought you were a step ahead. She, in fact, was. Because she already knew about Antoinette following them around. And then finally, the reveal, she's the one who told Lestat. Because it's like, yeah, how did Lestat know about Claudia in the train? Because I guess in that moment is when Claudia was like, there's no way he would have been able to figure that out on his own. Because I guess she must have tried to block her thoughts. But I wonder, like, she's still a newbie at this whole vampire thing. I mean, because Claudia is definitely older than her when it comes to the whole vampirism thing. So it has to be a thing of she must have, like, regardless of it, because she's also probably, like, a lot more keen and more aware of who's out there. And because she's more, yeah, because I think her run-in with Bruce was like I think Lestat didn't really take that into consideration. her run-in with Bruce, that situation was a valuable lesson for her in some regards. Like, I don't want my words to get twisted. It was her fucking horrendous thing that happened to her, but she learned something from that and was never going to be caught off guard again like that. So she was probably aware of, like, right, if I'm ever putting something out there, she already knew if there's any vampires nearby that can hear me. So she probably already accounted for Lestat having someone else on his side, or maybe despite all that she tried to do, because she's still a newbie at this, Antoinette wasn't very good at hiding her own thoughts. Or maybe it could just simply be that Claudia always kept an eye on Antoinette, you know? So, I mean, they also showcase that when, like, Louis and Lestat were, like, in the coffin at one point in time. We see Claudia come out, because she probably already knew, like, I had to be careful because Louis is going to get too wrapped up in this. I hope he does, because it's like, right, she told him to keep a little shelf inside for her, and she'll pull him out right before it's time to kill Lestat. But obviously that doesn't work out. But yeah, she pinned Antoinette to the ground with a cane, and it came down to Louis being the one that was the blow to Lestat. And he's like, I'm glad it was you. I've always loved you with all of myself. So I'm glad if it's going to be anyone, that it's you who's going to put me out. And what he does, I was thinking, like, well, you're going to go for let's go, because spoiler alerts, I know, like, well, the next book is what, like, Queen of the Damned was kind of loosely based on. I know people didn't like the movie, but I know it's loosely based on another book in the series, and that's The Vampire Lestat. So I know, like, Lestat doesn't die. He continues on, because that's what the whole Queen of the Damned was, kind of like following him a little bit, wasn't it? Because wasn't Stuart Townsend's character Lestat? I don't remember, because I think that was the whole point, because it wasn't Tom Cruise because of that. I guess he just chose not to come back. But either way. So I already knew, like, Lestat wasn't going to die, but I was thinking, like, Louis would chop off his head, but it wouldn't be enough. Because even they're like, yeah, decapitation isn't something we know for sure. So I thought he was going to take the blade, grab it in front of Lestat's throat, and just go pull it back and completely lop off his head. But all he did was slit his throat. I'm like, that's not enough to kill him. But I guess consider the weakened state he's in, plus draining him of all the blood that was in him, you know. I thought that was interesting, especially how Louis put it poetically about how, like, right, he had bled out in a way no other human had, because it's like, yeah, no more humans are going to bleed their amount of blood, but Lestat's going to be gushing blood, because it's not only his, it's also the blood of everyone he feasted on that night. So he was like a stuffed pig in that moment, you know, kind of being bled out. But yeah, they disposed of the bodies, including Antoinette's, like, oh, hearing her scream out in pain as she's burning in the furnace. So it's like, yeah, but also when it came down to Lestat, neither one of them could get rid of it. So it's like, right, we put him in a coffin, wrapped the carpet, put him in a coffin, and, like, left him on the side of the street, and we left. Boom. The boat that we got for Tom, that was actually ours. Because I also love that out of anyone, it was Tom that was the one that was poisoned. Makes sense, because, like, Louis always had a gripe with him, and it's like, well, also because of how he talked down to Lestat, and that's for her, she knew immediately, like, that's what made him the perfect person, because I knew you'd want Tom for yourself, because you are that petty. You're too petty, uncle. I mean, also, like, yes, Louis had his issues with Tom as well, so it's like, but I guess it was a calculated risk that she knew out of anyone, Lestat would probably choose, like, no, Tom's mine, but, you know, so. But Daniel didn't believe any of this, because he's like, for him, it's like, none of this makes sense. And I love how he's dismantling everything Louis is saying, because it's like, first and foremost, this was a guy that you loved. Like, Claudia in particular would not just want to walk away from this. Like, it's like, oh, it was done. And it's like, no, what happens when you leave something on the side of the street? It's, you know, he's like, having lived near a dump with my wife, my first wife, he's like, I knew what happens. You leave something on the street, it gets taken to the dump. Who gets there, and what gathers at a dump? Big, plump rats. And I love that he says that are the size of Kevin Durant's sneakers. But he's like, I knew what you were hoping you were going to let Lestat leave, especially because those coffins had locks on the inside and not the outside. So he was able to eat. You were hoping, like, you were going to let him live. Because Claudia would have never just, like, she didn't, for one, like, him painting that picture, like, oh, like, he made it seem like Claudia had reservations. I was like, really? That's interesting. It's like, yeah, because it's total and complete and utter horseshit, because she was like, fuck that. burn the motherfucker. We need to do it. But he refused to, and he stopped Claudia from it, because he even says, like, these books, these pages, he's like, they're not just torn out. They're like almost measured to be cut out. And I guess it was meant to be like he wanted to make it seem like they were just torn out, but they were like precisely cut. He was like, this is some fabric. Once again, unreliable narrator is what Louis is, because he gets to pick and choose. And for Daniel, it's like, that's why we were in the same bullshit as before. You're picking and choosing what you want to tell, whether you want to tell this story to kind of give yourself a certain perspective to the public, whatever story you're trying to tell. You're trying not to paint yourself as a monster, because he was like, yeah, because he almost said, like, at one point it seemed like Claudia hated your guts. It's because she refused, like, he probably said some shit he shouldn't have said to her. Plus, it's like, when the time came, we were finally free of Lestat, but you can never fully be free of him, even in, potential death. You refused to burn him. You couldn't let go. Yet again, you're choosing Lestat over. And I think for her, that was like, either they did still go together or they went their separate ways afterwards. I think they probably stayed together, but it was just, Claudia had nothing but resentment for him, because it's like, right, even now, even when you're here with me, you didn't keep a little shelf in you for me. You still gave it all to Lestat in the end. That's all that mattered in the end. You don't, like, it doesn't, not even me. And obviously Louis was getting more and more frustrated. And then Rashida's like, hey, like, you're going to hear there's always two sides of the story. Listen to it all the way through, because once you hear what's happening, you will ultimately regret everything that you're saying to him right now. And Daniel's going in, and then you see at the very behind, you see Rashid take off his gloves and then goes for the contact. So I figured, like, that's how you best hide that. And I was like, are we going to find out? Because I was thinking, like, are we going to twist the story to be like, he's actually Lestat, like, you just kind of presented him a certain way, but this is actually Lestat? I'm like, is this... I didn't know who Rashid was going to be, but then it turns out Rashid is actually Armand. I think that was his name, Armand, a 514-year-old vampire. Because he was like, yeah, you probably don't remember. He's like, memory's a funny thing. He's like, what did you describe it as? A monster? I wonder, because he's like, right, this time, like, unlike San Francisco, Louis won't be able to protect your life, because I guess Rashid or Armand wanted to kill him, but Louis, or rather, he's the one that stopped Louis from killing Daniel or something. It's like, right, you can't, but I won't hold him back this time. And it's like, who is this? This is Armand, the love of my life. So I guess, like, sometime after the Lestat situation, I guess, like, maybe kind of implying, like, I'm assuming, just, once again, I'm basing this on slight memory of the movie, but I do remember, spoilers if you don't want to know, I do know Claudia meets a pretty bad end, but I don't remember the circumstances around. That's why I'm like, I don't know if Lestat catches up with them and then kills Claudia in retribution. Because I know, like, obviously Louis not a part of Lestat's story in the next story that is his, so they've gone their separate ways, so I don't know. I'm also curious to see how they handle that. Like, I mean, once again, my understanding of, and those stories could be completely different. But I know that, like, Lestat's story continued in, like, Queen of the Damned, so I'm curious, like, how they're going to handle that. Would they make that, like, a spin-off from this, or will it be part of this? Because those are two separate books, Interview with the Vampire and The Vampire Lestat. Because that might cover some of Lestat's past and where he is present day, if he's still around. But, it's like Louis found someone else. And there's still interesting and complications to the story, but obviously implying there's still so much history. I mean, this is only the 1930s currently, I think is what it is. So, yeah, it's the, like, late 1930s, I believe. So, there's still so much history to tell, so much story to tell. I do know the show was already renewed for a second season. I want to say, might have even before it aired, because I know AMC is, well, not just AMC, I know some places do that, but I think AMC has done that from time to time, where they renew stuff ahead of time. So, it's already nice knowing we're getting a second season, so that's good to know. And I even love the end of part 1, so... having never read the book, if you don't have to tell me spoilers or anything, but considering how much of the story has been told, if you've read the book, I am curious, where are we book-wise? Are we in, like, we're covered about a fourth of the book? Have we covered, like, a fifth? Like, how much of the book story is left? Because that would kind of give you a big understanding of, like, how many seasons the story would need to tell its story. Like, if this was, like, for example, like, a third of the book, it means, like, the show would probably need at least 2 more seasons to fully tell its story, depending on how they want to go about it pacing wise and stuff like that. But Yeah, I'm very, very excited for season two to see where we go, how this story continues, learning more about Louis and this whole Armand situation, um, everything that went down with Lestat, Claudia. We'll ultimately have to wait and see what goes down when the show returns for season two. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.